Yeah, and anyone in today's engineering all hands, we are very glad to have a great guest to be featured. He'll be giving his talk very shortly once we have some of the more participants joining in probably 1 or 2 minutes. We're glad to have him taking this chance of giving his talk over the internet. But for sure, Jina is looking at potential opportunities to meet up everybody offline in person. So if you want to have Jina's presence in your location, just pin us in the community channel, and also you can send out a note to deborah@jina.ai. We'd love to see you in person as well.
Okay, shall we kick off?
Let's get started.
Perfect. All right. Welcome everybody to yet another Jina AI Engineering All Hands. We're very lucky today. We have with us a special guest speaker, Dr. Ibrahim Haddad. He's the Executive Director of the Linux Foundation AI and Data Foundation, and he'll be giving a talk about how you transition from a user to a leader and how to plan your enterprise journey in open source. Before going into that, though, just the usual housekeeping stuff. For anyone totally new here, Jina is an open source cloud native search framework for any kind of data, powered by deep learning. In short, we let you build a search engine for text, images, audio, 3D meshes, amino acids, you name it. If a neural network can understand it, you can use Jina to build your search engine with it. Our Engineering All Hands is our monthly public event online, a summary of what's going on. We share milestones, show and tell. We love to get questions from the community, and we're always open to the community. It's second Tuesday of every month, 2 p.m. to 3:30-ish, right here on Zoom. A few upcoming things. We are having a talk for 𝗱𝘁 in Switzerland on September 23rd. And on September the 30th, we have our Jina and Tonic public meetup event. That's offline, physically in Berlin. So if you're around, come and join us. We've got a couple of talks for you lucky people today. So first of all, as I mentioned, Ibrahim Haddad will be talking about planning your enterprise journey in open source. And secondly, which I forgot to change that number, we've got our engineer, Aladdin, who's going to speak about profiling in Python. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll hand over to Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take 1 second to share my screen and then kick off the presentation. And in the meantime, I would like to thank Jina very much for the invitation and for having me on this call and to address you and their audience on how organizations can transfer from being a user of open source software to becoming a leader in the space. Just 1 second as I load my screen. The testing worked fine, and now it's like it's a bit. Oh, there we go. You should be able to see my screen, and I'm going to turn on my video as well. So thank you again for Jina, and thank you for everyone for taking time in their day to attend this talk. The title of the presentation is Transitioning from a Consumer of Open Source to a Leader, Planning Your Enterprise Journey. And due to time limitation, I've created a section in the presentation dedicated for giving recommendations to developers on how they can similarly transition from a kind of occasional contributor to open source project to become a trusted committer and the maintainer. So I will skip this presentation, part of the presentation, but the slides are available, and Alex will make them available for you so you can read these presentation sections on how similarly a developer can go through that transition as well. So why open source? Why it's important? And I think, from my perspective, I always try to focus on the strategic aspect of it. Of course, there are a lot of kind of tactical advantages. However, from a strategic perspective, in my opinion, there are 6 major reasons of why open source is so critical in today's environment. The first one is you can look at it as another tool in your toolbox. So if you are a company, you are an organization, involved in open source activities, you look at open source as just really another tool. You do, as an organization, you do research with universities, you have your proprietary research, you're most likely involved with foundations, you're involved with industry consortia, etc. And the open source ecosystem is yet another channel and another venue for you to capitalize on your innovation and accelerate. So it's really critical from that perspective, and it's just yet another way for you to enforce your ongoing efforts in whatever space you're in. The second reason is product dependency. Actually, what's really interesting, what you see on the screen is a screenshot of a presentation I used to do during my Samsung days, where I would ask a question in the room and I would say, how many of these products that we create at Samsung use open source? And, people start to make a guess, maybe half of them, maybe 10, 15, 2, 3, etc. And the true answer is all of them. So today, it's extremely hard to build a product or even a service for that matter without using open source. So that dependency is very critical, and that's why open source is extremely important. A third reason is the flexibility of the business model. There are different ways you can use open source, whether build on top of it, incorporate it with your code, build with it, etc. So there are a lot of flexibility, coming from the licensing of it that allows you to be really creative in incorporating it as part of your offering. Software is eating the world, and open source is eating the software world. So software is extremely critical. You can be in the transportation business, in finance, in healthcare, in any kind of business vertical or industry, and your reliance on software is extremely high. And within that software, open source umbrella is really the largest piece of the pie there. And of course, you might be familiar with the 80-20 principle, where 80% of your activities will only generate 20% of value, while your 20% of value of effort will generate 80%. And so basically, you don't want to spend a lot of time recreating a lot of things that does not really add much value. And this is where open source comes in and fill in the blank. And the number 6 reason is enablement. You can enable your products, whether directly or indirectly, and it's all supported by different ways of using open source. So these are, from my perspective, kind of the critical areas from a strategic perspective on using open source. And of course, as we've been moving in the enterprise, if you look back 20, 25 years ago, there has been really a massive adoption of open source across global industries. And as a result of that, companies started to establish what they refer to as open source program offices, or OSPOs. And today, most large companies have an OSPO, even smaller companies have kind of a limited version of it. And what you see on the screen is a survey by the To-Do group on the open source programs. And what's really interesting are the benefits that were identified by the survey participants. So organizations with open source program, they have more awareness of the open source code they're using. They have increased speed and agility in their development activities. They actually do execute better license compliance. They have more influence in open source communities, et cetera, et cetera. So there are really massive benefits to organizing the work of open source within any given enterprise. And the journey for any organization follows the following pattern. So organizations start being curious about open source. Developers start using and adopting different pieces here and there. And basically, this is what you call kind of the consumer aspect, where you are consuming or using open source. So you're exposed to it as an organization and you start using it. Then there is some select contribution and select participation, whether it's on Slack or mailing list, on some bug fixes here and there, some improvements. And at that point, that effort within an organization starts to be managed. And seeing really positive advantage to doing this, organizations start kind of committing more in terms of contributing. And then at that phase, you move to become a contributor as an organization. And of course, this is on a project per project basis. And the target is to become a leader and a maintainer or a trusted committer in that project, and then grow your influence to the project so that you're able to influence the project in a direction that is positive, both for the community itself and for your own efforts internally, driving the project in a favorable way to the products or services you're trying to build. So what I will do for the next few slides is we will look into these different strategies, the consumer, contributor, leader, and kind of discuss what a company needs to implement internally so that they would able to support activities in that category, whether it's consuming or contributing or becoming a leader. So from a consumption and compliance infrastructure perspective, so if you're looking at the first scenario, which is an organization that only interested in consuming or using, integrating open source in their product and services. So you can see when you initially think about it, it doesn't seem like, hey, that's going to take a lot of efforts. But in reality, there's really a whole infrastructure that needs to be set in place to enable proper use of open source within that context. So we'll start from the left. So you need to have a strategy for compliance. Of course, legal compliance is essential. Hundreds of thousands of developers are coming together, building, billions of dollars worth of common software components. And the last thing you want to do is not follow the licensing terms of any given components used. So you need to have a strategy for complying, a strategy for how you manage compliance inquiries. You need to figure out kind of what changes you need to do to your M&A activities to accommodate for open source, and what kind of changes you need to implement in your supply chain in terms of software procurement, also to accommodate for open source intake. From a portal perspective, typically organizations, as they start using open source, they create an internal site, mostly used for educational purposes to make available for its employees the different policies and rules and guidelines in relation to using open source. And typically they have an externally facing website where they meet the obligation of the various open source components and packages they're using, in addition to internal and external messaging, explaining what they're doing with respect to open source, how to reach out to them, how to get involved with them, and so on. Now, the critical piece is policies and processes. So there are multiple pieces to that. A company, an organization that is consuming open source typically have a process for compliance. And what that entails is understanding all the open source code they're using, the license of every specific component. And in many cases, also they do software security audits to identify any known security vulnerabilities in this code. And then basically the end result of that process is producing a bill of software or software bill of material that will basically capture all the open source component, the licenses, any known security vulnerabilities, and that would be kind of the basis of your compliance. So at that point, as an organization using and consuming open source, you will know all the software you're using, all the open source software you're using, and then you will be better at complying with these licenses discovered through this exercise. In addition to the process, there are different policies that are put in place to guide the use and consumption of open source. There's, of course, the development aspect where developers are actually downloading packages, they're using GitHub, different channels, and integrating open source as part of the development they're doing. And for that, there are different typically milestones in the development process to be aware of any compliance issues that might be arise in the future. A lot of companies set up dedicated teams that can be for compliance or dedicated open source development teams. So this is kind of an essential milestone as well. And typically for organizations, older organizations that didn't exist that long ago when open source became kind of a de facto way of doing code, they actually introduced a lot of educational material for their employees, not just to teach them and instruct them on the company policies and processes, but also on the open source licenses, on the methodology itself, and provide different tools such as checklists to make sure everybody is aware of their responsibilities when it comes to properly and legally using open source code in their environment. There are a lot of tools that is typically made available to enable and accelerate that adoption internally. And of course, there are many initiatives that an organization can participate in to help it with this journey. Some of these initiatives are related to license compliance, such as OpenChain and SPDX, and others are related to helping companies share best practices in respect to open source usage. and building open source infrastructures and being effective at using open source and contributing to open source, such as the To-Do group, which is a Linux Foundation organization or work group that gathers organizations with open source program offices where they share best practices, tooling, and ways of working with open source. So this is, in a nutshell, kind of the infrastructure organizations typically put in place for their consumption and to comply with the licenses of open source code they use in production. You can see what you see on the screen is basically kind of a detailed approach to that. Organization aggressively using open source, they need to set up these various elements as part of their open source infrastructure that I've detailed in an earlier slide. So now we move to the next step, which is contribution. So most organizations start using open source, and then they realize, hey, we have a lot of reliance on different open source software or components in our stack. And some of these dependencies are very critical, and it would be very smart to contribute to these different projects and make sure they're viable and they're going to be there in the next year and 2 years and 5 years from now, because we depend on them and on the health of their community. And at that point, organizations expand their open source internal infrastructure, and that's really a soft infrastructure, not kind of IT infrastructure, to enable contributions, such as creating a policy and the process for contributing, so developers would know, what they need to do and how they can contribute while respecting the company policies and guidelines, and creating or setting up a team that oversees this contribution and approve them, in addition to increasing participation in the different open source projects that are of interest. Many organizations as well set up a dedicated group. In some cases, it's called Open Source Program Office, Open Source Technology Group, Open Source Team. There are different naming to it. And these individuals in that team are typically 100% upstream developers. They are set up by the company to focus on developing and contributing to upstream project that the company focuses on. So under that dedicated group, we have establishing the open source group, hiring anchor hires from the open source projects to ingrain them in their company and help them spread and grow the open source skills. At that point, that team as well is responsible for working with Open Source Foundation, collaboration with universities, hosting events, supporting different communities they use. And parallel to that, there are different open standards. This is different one company to another, depending on the space you're working on and whether there are open specifications that applies to your line of business or not. If there are, then you participate in these different open standards and support the activities while emphasizing the direction in a way that is positive and have a positive income to your product and service. So now we've moved from a kind of consumer with the internal infrastructure set up to a contributor with additional infrastructure within the organization to support that growth in terms of open source activities. And then the next step is really becoming a leader in these different communities and projects. And as you know, there are probably a lot of developers on this call, and open source leadership is on a case-by-case basis. You may be a great maintainer in WebKit, but you're really nobody in the Linux kernel, right? So it's on a project per project basis. And really the approach to open source leadership from a corporate perspective is increasing their investment in engineering, product management, and legal to support all of these different efforts. Basically, increased engagement with open source project, contributing to a lot more projects than previous scenarios, engaging with open source standards, becoming members in different open source foundations at a high level of membership that allows you to participate and set the direction of the foundation and influence the strategy and set up different collaboration within the industry. And of course, a lot of other activities in relation to that ecosystem. And these kind of differ slightly from vertical to vertical. So what you would do in finance, if you're an investment organization relying on open source, would be slightly different than what you would do if you're a semiconductor company and so However, the concept is very similar and applies to all companies and all industries. When we look at these different stages, the consumer, the participant, contributor, leader, I refer to them as pillars. There are a lot of intersections. So as you start consuming, you start also participating a little bit. And when you're a participant in different projects, active on the discussion boards, with the mailing list, sending patches here and there, that's how you kind of start tasting how it is to be a contributor. And most people like to contribute to the different project and see their work appreciated and become part of a larger community. And at that point, you're kind of transitioning into a contributor. And that's why you see kind of the overlap in these different boxes. And once you're a heavy contributor, you're kind of slightly and kind of slowly transitioning into becoming a leader. It doesn't happen overnight. It's kind of a switch that takes a while to turn on. This is kind of a typical transitioning from a consumer to slide participant and then contributor and leader. And when we look back maybe 20 years ago, or actually more, sometime in December or end of 2000, IBM was a great example, or is a great example. IBM announced investing $1 billion on Linux, and in year 2000, $1 billion seemed like it is a ton of money today, but back then such heavy investments was really kind of very unique. With these different transitions, company really start as consumer, and then they grow over time their participation to reach that leadership position. And there are a lot of companies today, as you look in the industry, that have been really recognized as leaders in different domains. And it's not a destination. Organizations don't work so hard to become a leader in different communities and different projects, and then they stop. Because if you stop, you lose that influence, you lose the contributions you're making so that you can support the project. And with that emerges new leaders, because they're putting a lot of efforts, more than your own organization. So there are a number of specific recommendations for organizations to help them with these different transitions. I will go through them very quickly to respect the time. I probably have a couple more minutes. Creating an open source program office. We've mentioned this earlier. This is kind of the office that manages all the efforts in relation to open source, whether it's intake, consumption, compliance, participation, contributing to projects, open source foundation, et cetera, which will organize all these different efforts under a single umbrella. Hiring or promoting a leader for open source within the company. This is really critical. You need to have somebody to drive all that effort, somebody who's accountable, and somebody who's responsible for getting an organization and moving it from a contributor to a leader. Building the open source team. A lot of organizations create dedicated upstream teams that focus on implementing and developing for the open source upstream projects they rely on. I've had the privilege of running such a team at Samsung, and it was really amazing to see how much influence you can have. And it's not that you require hundreds and thousands of developers. When I was at Samsung, Samsung had about 45,000 developers, and you were really a handful of people, and you were able to make such a big impact for Samsung in the open source space. So this is really critical. Developing and executing open source strategy, which of course will guide you through all of these different activities. And one of the starting points is to identify how much and where do you rely on open source. So as an organization that builds products and services, you would understand, where am I using open source and how much is that critical to me? And that's really your starting point to figure out which project you want to invest in and you want to put resources on to support these projects and grow them and enable them because you have deep reliance on them for the product and the service. Identify current and target open source position. So, in some cases, not a lot of companies are interested in becoming a leader. Some of them are really satisfied by just being a consumer. Some of them are satisfied by just being a slight participant. And some other companies, they're like, we're all in. We want to go. We want to use the projects. We want to contribute to them, and we want to become maintainers, and we want to drive the agenda and work with the community. So a lot of different companies have different agenda, and part of that strategy is figuring out where do you stand today and where you want to get, and use that as a way to set your agenda and your plan. Provide a flexible IT infrastructure. I suspect a lot of developers on this call, and there are a lot of companies that have some issues with firewall access and VPN and IMAP support for Linux and et cetera, and all of these issues need to be resolved so that the internal development team is able to work using the same tools and using the same capabilities as open source developer in other organizations and in the community internal. So IT infrastructure need to accommodate these different things. So building open source expertise, this is done at multiple levels. Organizations have a lot of training, whether it's technical, business training, ecosystem, partnership, legal, et cetera, et cetera. They need to have that expertise built into their different teams and so that they would be able to transition their organization from one position to another. And a lot of this expertise, in some cases, is brought into the company as hires. In many cases, is also promoted in the sense of providing training and knowledge transfer and helping individuals grow that knowledge and transfer and become more specialized. One interesting aspect of that is identifying metrics. Of course, organizations need to track their involvement and figure out where they're lacking to improve and where they're doing really well and so on. And part of that is understanding the metrics you need to track, because if you cannot measure a certain activity, it's extremely hard to figure out how you improve it or to know if you're doing well or not. We touched on training. Work with Open Source Foundation, you will realize that a lot of organizations really invest resources and efforts and time and money with Open Source Foundation. There is the Next Foundation with its several umbrella foundations, Edge, AI, Hyperledger, and many other umbrella foundations. There's the Mozilla Foundation, Apache, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of open source foundations that are homes to a lot of the critical projects for our infrastructure today. And companies really selectively decide where they want to participate depending on the activities of the foundation and the projects hosted by the foundation. Establishing a framework for open source code. This is basically the high-level process and policy for using, for contributing. If I'm a developer and I would like to contribute a piece of code, who should I talk to? What process should I do? What kind of step-by-step I need to follow to be able to move from the idea of wanting to contribute a piece of code to actually committing that in a pull request to GitHub. So that framework explains all of that and provides a direction and step-by-step for each of these activities. Fostering internal collaboration and exploring the adoption of inner source practices. Inner source is basically the ways a current organization can adopt open source practices for their internal development. It has been proven over and over again that open source development has really an amazing methodology that accelerates development, accelerates innovation. And a lot of organizations out there are looking into this model methodology and trying to study it and import from it all the good practices that they can take and implement for their internal development. So I would highly encourage organizations to look into this space. Participating in open source event, this is one of them. And by the way, it's really amazing to see a company like Jina running their all hands as an open source project. This is really unheard of, and big thumbs up for this. And it's really a huge measure of transparency where you're able to invite the community of your project to your internal company event and say, hey, we're developing in the open, although we sit in the home office or we sit in the corporate office, whether it's Berlin, Shanghai, or somewhere else, we talk in the open. We conduct our engineering development and we conduct our efforts in the open where everybody can participate and we don't have a hidden agenda. And this is really extremely interesting and really a level of transparency that's extremely hard to get. Establish collaboration with open source, as open source projects with universities. Universities are extremely important as an innovation hub. Think of the thousands of PhDs and master students looking for their thesis projects. are open and available to do their projects as an open source project with different organizations. So this is really a great innovation hub that organization can target. Updating software procurement. A lot of software comes to an organization via supply chain, and organizations need to update their how they get their software in-house, basically through running proper compliance audits, security audits, to make sure they capture all open source coming into their organization. So sorry, I've been running quite fast, but basically there are a lot of really practical items and tasks that organization can take and implement so that they help their transition from, a mere user of open source, say, I downloaded, the V8 engine and I'm going to use it, to becoming a leader in that project. However, through that journey from, a user to a participant, contributor, and leader, there are a lot of challenges. It's not an easy road, and that's why you don't see every company becoming a leader, because there are a lot of challenges and companies start to address them. And what I have on the screen is 5 different areas of challenges, ranging from culture to processes, tools, continuity, and education. And I would invite you to go deeper into this. And if you visit, if you go to Google search engine, there are a lot of resources available, or to my homepage where you can download a lot of educational pieces and papers on these different topics. The other section, though, that I won't be able to unfortunately address it given the time, is how a user or a developer in open source can transition from a mere contributor to become a leader. So similarly to an organization, developers start either as a user of the software or the tool, library, framework, or as a contributor because they're paid as part of their work to work on that framework or library. And then their ultimate goal is to move from user or contributor to become trusted committer or maintainer, depending on the nature of the project and the different levels. And in the next few slides, which are available, and Alex will, from Jina, will make them available to you, I described, in details what a developer can do so that they help their personal transition from becoming a contributor to becoming a leader. So if you're out there, if you're a contributor to Jina AI, and you want to become a maintainer in Jina AI, I'm providing you some tips that will help you drive this transition for you. There are really amazing amount of innovation that can be unlocked by this kind of collaborative development. And I think the principles to embrace is that, number one, we cannot hire all the smart people in the world. I mean, look at the largest companies, IBM, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all these, Tencent, Baidu, all these different large tech companies. They cannot go and hire everybody smart in this world. They need to figure out a way that they can collaborate with them. And that way is open source. Open source or open source R&D create a huge amount of value. Think of all the open source code available out there. It's billions and billions of dollars worth of R&D efforts across 2.5 to 3 decades so far. And the internal efforts within any organization is really an attempt on how they can uncover and claim a portion of that open source value and using it in their products and services. And of course, my last point is we don't need to be able to be the creator of the project to benefit from it. Let's take Jina, for example. You can be an e-commerce organization, and you don't need to be the creator of Jina, but you can use Jina to help you do a better neural search on your catalogs, on your products, and all that, and enable your activities. So this is really a great example on you as somebody who didn't create the project, but yet it's an open source project that you can go and use and benefit from for the value of your organization. So open source is really a massive disruptor. It's been disrupting and will continue disrupting for decades to come. And I'm really glad personally to be part of this and to be, fate has put me in this kind of open source ecosystem, and I'm extremely grateful for it. Thank you very much, Jina, for the invitation today. And I apologize for any technical difficulties through the chat, and I'm just going to pass it to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. There was a question coming from our chat. So Mike was asking, what is the proper open source team size, 5 or 10?
Yeah. So the cool thing about this question is that there is no wrong answer. There is no right size. There are organizations that, and I have a different. I'm actually building a public presentation specifically on this topic because organizations start building open source program offices. They put engineers in them, and ultimately the role of this program office, open source program office, is to make sure that the whole company becomes an open source company. That every developer knows how to contribute to open source. They understand the methodology and the methods and the tools and all of this. And the transition I see personally looking and working with hundreds of companies is that organizations start an open source office, they put the open source developer in them, and then this office becomes larger and larger. And eventually, the end result is that all these developers actually go into other parts of the company. And suddenly the open source office moved from being, 500, 600 developers in a large organization to be like 4 or 5 people. So for example, case in point, Facebook, if you look at Facebook open source organization, they have, I think, 4 or 5 people. But what's the difference? The difference is that every developer in Facebook is an open source developer. So there is no right size. It's really how you help move your company from a company to an open source company, and by making everybody as an open source developer and open source advocate.
Yeah, and we also have another one from Vaishnavi. Does it require a degree in computer science to be a leader in open source?
Absolutely not. I actually had when I was in a previous company, I hired one of the top Linux kernel maintainers, really fantastic, amazing, smart guy. He had a degree in music. And actually this is just one of thousands of examples where people study I had people studying doing psychology and really non-mathematical backgrounds, and coming in contact with open source and being interested in software development and so on, and becoming maintainers and really fantastic developers. A degree is, I think the process of going through college is really some kind of a training, for the job, but it's not, you can get that training on the job if you have enough passion and interest in yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
As someone who studied Chinese instead of computer science and still ended up in the field of AI, yes, more than agree.
Yeah, and it's a guy who's coming from a financial background. Yep, but we have a very last one for Ibrahim, so we'll free you to go. So how does DevRel engineers play a role in this process of moving forward open source?
So I think, the whole development methodology is changing, and the old, if you think, 10 years ago, maybe, and even before that, it used to be, let's build a prototype, move it into full development, do QA on it, get the feedback. And now it's becoming that kind of continuous loop. Now you have CDCI and all of these different things. And for me, DevRel is this. I mean, my wife used to be a QA engineer, and now she cannot find a job as just a QA. She needs to be a developer. And a QA is a developer, is a tester, is an architect, and I think, DevRel is, for me, is the advocate of the company at a technical level. It used to be, community managers, kind of quote unquote, creating hype around, the project and the community and the activities, and make sure people are involved and so on. But developer relations for me is you're figuring out how can we eliminate friction so that developers can come in and find our project frictionless for contribution. What are the possible problems a developer can face in their workflow that we can go in and remove these different friction elements. So it is a developer, it's a QA engineer, it's a marketing, it's a business development, all of these combined, but unfortunately still gets one paycheck. So, it's really a fascinating job, really, because of the visibility they have across all different stakeholders in the project.
Yeah. Thank you, Ibrahim. It's very helpful for us to understand open source better, and also guiding a little bit better for Jina team to understand what we need to do as an open source business. applause to Ibrahim. Thank you for your time today. And definitely everybody online. We not only have Ibrahim today, it's also Jina Engineering All Hands. We are having one of our engineer who's a rising star, a very young, energetic engineer who'd love to share some of our best learnings around profiling Python. So Aladdin, I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. This presentation is about profiling in Python and how we can use profiling to identify bottlenecks in applications. So for the content of this presentation, first we will define profiling, and then we will see different profiling tools for Python. So we have cProfile, Yappy, PyTest profiling, and then we have Timeit and the line profiler. So what is profiling? Here, profiling refers to collecting a set of statistics that describe the execution time and how often parts of the program have been executed. So profiling will generate timing statistics about code execution. And the reason why we do profiling is to identify bottlenecks in the code base. So to do profiling, there are various tools, the ones that we mentioned earlier. And eventually, some of them can render these statistics into a call graph. So a call graph is a generic concept in programming. It's not specific to Python. And it's a graph where nodes represent functions. So the information inside these nodes can be the name of the function, how many times it was called, and we also have the time information. So for the time information, we can have two types, either the own time or the total time. So the own time means the time execution of the function, excluding the subsequent function calls. And the total time will include the subsequent function calls. So for example, main, if it does call another function, for example here, add banana, the time consumed by add banana will be excluded in the own time. So in this graph, we also have vertices which link between parent functions and children functions. And children functions are functions that are called inside the parent functions. So here, for example, we have main, and it called the function add banana, and it also called other functions like the constructor and eat bananas. So, so now we will discuss the first profiling tool, which is cProfile. And cProfile is the official recommended profiler in Python. It is built in C, and it does offer a reasonable overhead. So all the profilers, they will add some overhead to the execution. So execution should be longer. However, for cProfile, this execution is reasonable, and also it is deterministic, meaning that it will not be variable from call to call. Also, cProfile offers a function-based profiling, which means that the granularity of the profiling will be functions. It can give you the execution time for functions, but it cannot give you execution time for each instruction inside the function. And of course, function-based profiling can generate graph calls. And then we have similar profilers that behave similar to cProfile. There is Yappy, which is also built in C, but it does have a more flexible API than cProfile. However, it does add more overhead. There's also profile, which is a pure Python implementation. It imitates 𝗔𝗪𝗂, but it adds a huge overhead. And we should note that Yappy and 𝗔𝗪𝗂, they integrate with PyCharm. Now we're going to see a 𝗔𝗪𝗂 demo. So over here in PyCharm, I have a script that we want to profile. And so the first step, if we want to use 𝗔𝗪𝗂 with PyCharm, we need to have our Python interpreter configured. So to do so, we can go to File and then Settings. And then we have the Python interpreter over here. So we should click on Show All and then add our interpreter. So it can be either a new virtual environment or an existing environment. So since I already have my interpreter configured, I will not perform this step. And then once we have the interpreter ready, we can start profiling. So the first step is to run our script, and this will generate a run configuration in PyCharm. So so the run configuration looks like this. So we have the script path, and we have also the working directory. Yeah, so now once we have the run configuration ready, we can use the profiler. So there is this button here, and once we click on it, PyCharm will tell us that the profiler has started. So, and once profiling is finished, we will see this statistics table. So, by the way, here we are profiling the construction of documents in Jina. And in this table, we have the name of functions, the call count, which is the number of calls made to these functions, and we have the time and the on time, as we explained earlier. So we also have the call graph rendered for us. So if we zoom into the call graph, we can see the nodes that represent the functions, and of course we can track the root node, and in the root node we have two calls. The first one represents imports in Python, so we can ignore this, and the second one is the document construction. And then for the document construction here, we can see the call to numpy.random, which will generate blobs for us. And then we have the actual document construction. So in each node, we can see the total time here, the percentage of the total execution time, and we can see also the on time. And we can also see that the graph is heated, meaning that functions that take most of the time will tend to be red, and the others will tend to be green. And this is how we can identify the bottlenecks inside our application. So that's it with the 𝗔𝗪𝗂, which means we can move to the next tool. So for this one, we have Yappy, and Yappy stands for yet another Python profiler. So it's a profiler that is thread, coroutine, and green-red aware. So it lets you profile async applications or multi-threaded applications. By default, if you install Yappy, PyCharm will be using it. So to install it, we just do pip install Yappy, and here we have the GitHub repository of Yappy. So let's do a demo with Yappy, and all right. So the first step is to install Yappy. So I will do pip install Yappy. And now we can start profiling with Yappy. So since we want to see the profiling of the async application, we can use the Jina flows, which since it's an asynchronous application. So again, here we will start with this script. So basically, we have a dummy executor which will do a print here to the console, and we create our flow, and then we index. We send one document to the flow, and here I will do profiling. So we already have the run configuration ready. So I will click on profile, and this will tell us that we are using Yappy profiler now instead of 𝗔𝗶𝘂𝗃. And of course, this will generate the .pstat file. Again, we have the same table with some tweaks, I would say. Here, the graph looks like this, and it does not have only one root node. It can have many root nodes because it's not tracking only the main thread. It can also track the other threads. Yeah, so this is the graph for our flow, and here also we can navigate to the source code of a node. So right click and then navigate to source, and this should take you to the source code of the profiled function. And we can also profile the asynchronous execution. So over here we can see this arrow, and then we select concurrency diagram. And when running the concurrency diagram, we can see the main thread, but also we can see the other threads. And of course, there is the async IO graph where we can see all the tasks that have been executed. And we can also see that there are different statuses of execution. So when it's green, it means it's a normal execution. If it becomes yellow, it means that the thread is waiting for a lock, and it can be a potential bottleneck. Blue means it's running with a lock, and red, it's a deadlock, and it's a potential bug in the application. And yeah, so this is all about Yappy, profiling with Yappy. And then we have some other tools that I will mention quickly. So we have PyTest profiling, and we use it when we want to profile unit tests, because you cannot use 𝗔𝗶𝘂𝘃 or Yappy if you want to profile unit tests. So it's a plugin for PyTest. It will generate heated graphs. Under the hood, it uses 𝗔𝗶𝘂𝘃. So this is the Pipefi project for PyTest profiling. And yeah, this is the command to install it. To set it up, we should add it to the PyTest plugins in conftest.py. And to to use it, we just run PyTest as usual, and then add these two parameters, -- profile and -- profile SVG, to actually generate all the files that we need. So this will generate an SVG file, which is actually the call graph. And we also have another tool, which is Timeit. So Timeit is useful when you want to measure small code snippet execution time. Thanks. Yeah, so if Timeit will execute code snippets many times and will output the average for them. Under the hood, it relies on timer.perf counter, and you can use it in many places, for example, in a console or script, or inside the command line, or even in Jupyter Notebook. And finally, we will have the line profiler. So line profiler offers per line profiling. So it's as opposed to a function-based profiling, which is offered by cProfile and Yappy. And the line profiler will help you identify hotspots that were missed during a function-based profiling. So suppose there is an instruction that takes a lot of time, but since it's atomic, and since the cProfile will only perform a function-based profiling, you may miss it. So you can use the line profiler to identify it. The way to use it is by explicitly telling line profiler which functions to profile. So by default, it will not profile everything in your code base. So this is the GitHub repository for this tool. And the setup should be as easy as doing pip install line profiler. And then we decorate the functions that we want to profile like this. So just add @profile. Of course, if there are warnings from the IDE, let's say this profile decorator is not found, we should ignore it. And then we have these two commands. The first one will use our script to generate a .lprof file, which contains the statistics about the execution. And finally, we use this command to render or transform this _lprofile file into readable statistics. So this is all about Python profiling. So happy profiling for everyone, and I wish that it helped you reduce bottlenecks in your applications. And of course, feel free to ask questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Aladdin, for that enlightening talk. You've really raised your profile there.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll share my screen quickly and we'll go on to Q&A. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see that.
Perfect. Okay, so any Q&A from our wonderful audience about Aladdin's talk or about Jina and what we're doing in general?
So someone is asking that what sets Jina aside from other neural search engines?
Okay, that is a good question. Any of our engineers want to jump in and jump on that one?
Yep. So what I see in a lot of other search engines or search databases like FICE is that they mostly care about the vector multiplication part and not about the infrastructure and scaling part, and also not about the ecosystem part. So you can, in a lot of the search systems, you can, once you have your vectors, store them, but you, at least as far as I'm informed, not often don't get somehow encoders directly with you. They just say, okay, I want to use this model, and it works out of the box. And having this whole infrastructure, and once you have built it, we're currently developing a module where you, once you've built it locally, you can directly deploy it to Kubernetes in one click. Change more or less, you just have to ramp up your Kubernetes cluster, And then there you can scale with sharding and replicas. And this is something that I at least have not seen elsewhere. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, this I think sets us apart.
General perspective, Jina is more looking at a general pipeline to set up to solve the search problem. There are a lot of search, I would say, components that is ready for targeting neural search, but it takes you quite some time to actually compile a system that can actually run with data inject and then fetch the data that you want. But Jina is looking at building the whole set in very short amount of time and then get your system running. So that's also a major difference. And Jina is highly customizable, that you can leverage the component that you built for yourself. For example, all of the modeling can be easily plug and play to the pipeline that's set up by Jina. So we've put all of our knowledge and also the know-how around building up a search system in the easier way, and basically the easiest way for our community member and all of the Jina users to build up a search system. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I found the plug and play aspect just so useful, and it speeds up development so much. So like I can take on examples.jina.ai, I built a search engine for memes, and you can search using text by searching captions, or you can search by uploading an image and it'll find similar images. I've since taken the meme search project and with 1 or 2 lines of code, replaced the model and the encoder entirely with a different one. And it's just so simple.
And also we've seen another question coming from Philip. How does Jina compare to Elasticstack? What are the advantages of Jina? That's a very good one that we've been asked quite a lot from our investors to our community members to our users. So in general, we've seen the potential why we're doing Jina, right? We've seen a lot of different modality type of data that is popping up every day. So you might not be searching for information on TikTok, a mobile app that is full of short videos, right? It's a very different type of information conveyed nowadays. So we need a better solution to process all this type of data. While Elastic's great of handling the structured data, of doing symbolic search, but imagine how can you transfer all of the knowledge or information into text? That's a question mark. So how to like search the information in a more direct way, that is to process the data itself. That's the big advantage that Jina can take. We can process any kinds of data, leveraging the deep learning models integrated into the platform. And it's going to be easier to bootstrap the system to process all kinds of data. So we've got our demo searching for the code. We've got our community members interested in using Jina to search for token in the space of NFT or whatever. And we've got our community member using Jina to search for 3D meshes, to search for 3D models, which was not accessible even before without any text information. So that doesn't really change the system to be very complicated, but still to keep the search system very lean to process all these complicated data sets. And also later on with Jina, you will be able to get more fruitful data insights out from the data itself. So that's the major difference, I think, from now on, and also even in future when it comes to Elastic or Jina. So it's more about solving the problem in different centuries, we would say. So Jina is a new design pattern for developers to process the data in all kinds of structure. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. Or any engineers would have more technical understanding we want to share.
To summarize what Bing was saying, if there's a neural network that can understand a kind of data, then with a few lines of code, you can integrate that into your search. So today, we're messing around with 3D meshes and amino acids. Tomorrow, it could be anything, you name it.
Great. I guess we don't have too much of a question, but still we have a very community-friendly moment. So I would like to know if anybody from community would like to say hi to everyone or have any thoughts that you want to collaborate with Jina.
And if no one says anything, I'm going to be the you know, the angry old school teacher who calls people out by name. So either step forward now or be called up forward. Okay, no one?
Wait a second. I think someone from the community is asking to speak.
Hi, hello.
Hey, Vaishnavi.
Hello. So not exactly collaboration from my side, but Hacktoberfest is coming up. So last year, like a few open source communities and projects, they were collaborating with it, and they were like having, along with Hacktoberfest, they were having some of their own challenges, like the meme challenge you had earlier, similar to that, but code. Like, so are you planning, because the projects that participated last year, they had like a great outreach for that.
So we worked with Hacktoberfest last year, and we're looking at working with Hacktoberfest and a lot of other community events in the coming months as well. So stay tuned to our Slack for more info on that, but that is stuff we're actively working on right now.
Oh, that was great. I wasn't aware about working. You were working last year as well.
Yeah, probably check out this year and don't miss it. And feel free to invite your friends who would be interested in this as well. And we'd love to see more exciting project that is built on top of Jina.
Sure, thank you.
Joni, are you there? Yoni? I'm not sure how to say your name.
Yes, I'm here. Hey.
Oh, it's good to hear your voice and not just see your Slack profile.
Well, I actually even had a question. Is there going to be a Jina cloud hosting available at some point? Because I have some problems where, well, one dataset would be 55 terabytes, and I can't really store it. I have run out of storage. So I'm just thinking on how to deploy massive projects like that. And maybe a bit short introduction. Well, I used to be an entrepreneur, or well, a startup CTO. I just quit, and I now have my freedom to do all kinds of cool projects.
For the Jina cloud, yes, but probably not soon enough to catch up the current timing. But that's definitely something we're considering, because there are multiple requests coming from our customers and also our community members who are looking into it. But definitely to get the whole Jina core and also hub images ready at the most convenient way for people to bootstrap the system is the current priority for Jina, that to fit general community needs. But definitely, we heard you, Oni. We'll be working on that.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's a lot of data.
May I ask, just out of interest, how many data documents would you have there? So would it be billions, or would it be just 100,000 documents with a lot of data, or how is the data distributed there?
That is actually a data set of research articles.
Mm-hmm.
All of them.
Okay, cool. So a billion, roughly, I guess.
Yeah, love the level of numbers that we're looking at.
Yes, me too. Cool.
But now
you can probably also reach out in community channel. Our engineers can help assist on better solving the problem, and also we'd like to know how Jina would be helping you at scale. That helps the whole Jina progress moving forward.
Okay, Hare Krishna, how's it going? It's good to have you here.
Nice interacting with you all. It was nice session. So looking out for Hacktoberfest and interacting with you all.
Nice. Do you have much background in Python, or what's your background?
Yeah, I have background in Python and Bash profiling. So, and I am also learning cloud native applications based. It's not so long time, but it's a very few days. So it was nice in Jina AI communities to be there.
Fantastic. Yeah, Python and cloud native applications, two great tastes that taste great together.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, who else have we got? Philip, you want to say hello?
Sure. Hi.
Yes, Philip is the fan of is the Lord of the Jina fan club. He started it. We give him very special swag to keep him on side.
Yeah, here, wait a second. I have it straight here. But
That's a special one.
Yeah, but I need the part to put it in, Alex. You missed it last time.
Ah, well, I've got to keep you coming back.
Yeah, for sure.
But yes, if you want to win your own custom 3D printed medal with your name on it, then we will be running more competitions. We're actually going to run a poll in the Slack channel about what kind of competitions should we run. Should we run another meme competition? Should we do who can write the best blog post? Should we do who can use Jina in the most ridiculous way?
The coolest short demo of Jina, or some kind of a Gradior or Streamlit application using Jina, but in an inconvenient way. So make it special.
Yes,
Yeah,
special. That's the word. But yes, I will post the poll in our community Slack, likely tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then everybody can get on there and vote.
I guess, Alex, we're out of time, so probably we can wrap it up, so we don't keep everybody too long on the session online.
That's right. Well, thank you everybody for coming once again. If you want to find our contact information, it's right here. GitHub repo get.jina.ai, slack.jina.ai, of course, for joining us there, and the usual social links.
Yeah.
We've also got our new docs website up now at docs.jina.ai. It's a lot more comprehensive and a lot prettier than what we had before. So, all right. I hope to see you all next time, second Tuesday of every month. And if you're in Berlin, we would love to buy you a drink. Come over to our Jina and Tonic event. It's around Berlin Mitte on the last Thursday of every month. So I believe that's on the 30th of this month, September. And check our meetup page for info on that. All right, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of the day wherever you are, and see you.